Totalitarian, Part 3. 25. Dossier. Lacole told her story, and Harper listened intently. He could tell it had affected her deeply. Her story was told with a disconnected emotion that Harper knew too well. "I'm sorry," said Harper, looking up at her. "It isn't your fault," said Lacole, walking out the room. Harper really did feel for her. He took a moment to think. The true evil of the regiment he had belonged to was becoming apparent. He ran his hand across his face and looked up like a religious man asking God for forgiveness. He knew he had to do something to tame that cobra-like conscience that hissed at him. Its venom was taking hold. He knew walking away wasn't going to kill it. His weapon would now be hope. When Lacole re-entered the grey box room, she had a document in her hand. It was cased in a thin black folder. Down the side, it read, "Solution." "I managed to get this," said Lacole, handing Harper the document. "What is it?" asked Harper, flicking through its pages. "It's a 48-page dossier. It's what the EE intend to do, to impose on the local populace, starting here in London. They intend to rid the country of all immigrants, anyone who doesn't speak the language, so-called the non-ideal. Well, I intend to stop them." "What?" said Harper, raising an eyebrow. "Look. Are you in? If you are, there's no going back. After today, I don't think I can go back. So you're in, because they won't take you back. That's what you're saying, isn't it?" said Lacole with thin, judging eyes. "I'm in, because of the things I saw them do. Them terrible things." Lacole didn't say anything. She dared to believe him. She had found him alone, holding the girl close, like he was protecting her. No way would an EE officer be found like that normally. She gave Harper a trusting nod. "Come with me," said Lacole. She took him down the corridor to a room further down. It was identical to the other, except for one beautiful difference. The little girl sat in the centre of the room. She seemed bright and wonderful in her red dress that seemed to glow. She contrasted vividly against the grey room, relieving the blur in Harper's mind. His emotion centred on her. She was now a purpose, a bright flower, offering heart, a reason. He felt a responsibility for her now, and in that moment he embraced it. For the first time in his adult life, he truly cared for someone. He walked up and embraced her in his arms. He had known her less than a day, but he adored her. With Bella in his arms, he turned to see Lacole staring at him. She stood in the doorway, her head tilted against the door frame. Her brown eyes opened, and he could see she was overcome with emotion. She turned away, trying not to cry. "Let's go. I want to show you someone," said Lacole. 26. Sunset. Lacole led them out the building onto the street. The fires of the earlier wreckage could be seen a few streets away as black smoke wisped over the nearby buildings, disappearing to the grey clouds above. The trio stood in the streets with an uneasy silence. They didn't feel safe, but the EE's raid was over, for today. Lacole led the way past the construction site and the grey buildings and the dust-covered cars. It was late afternoon, and the sun seemed to give buildings an orange glow. They walked for 20 minutes on deserted streets of the capital. Lacole reached her destination and turned towards a green door on a terraced street, 3 stories high. She pressed the intercom. As they waited, an electrical buzz signalled Lacole that the door was open. Harper still carried Bella and followed her in. The building's foyer was small. In front of them was a questionable-looking green lift with graffiti on it. To the right, a wooden staircase. They opted for the stairs. Down the corridor, Lacole walked to the middle door, and as she turned and watched Harper walk towards her, her heart began to pulse, and her palms sweated. He still wore the black EE uniform. It screamed terror. His leather boots seemed to slam onto the checkered floor. His jacket flared open, reminding her of the wings of a raven. She looked at his leather gloves and felt pain in her stomach. They were the same gloves that violated her in prison. Harper stood beside Lacole, who turned her lips up in disgust. "What are you looking at me like that for?" said Harper, putting Bella on the ground. "Take off your jacket," said Lacole. Harper didn't understand what she meant. Lacole sighed and turned towards him. She grabbed his jacket at the shoulders and slipped it off him. She pulled down at the sleeves, and as she did, they got very close. She stepped in closer, and their bodies touched. She felt her breast against his chest. With the jacket off, she stepped back and looked at Harper, who was trying to stop the smile growing on his face. Lacole gave him a look of disgust. One she had to force, lifting her eyebrows and shaking her head. "Now what are you looking at?" said Lacole. He could see she was showing emotion she didn't feel, trying to look more annoyed than she actually was, which made him smile more. He wasn't exactly attracted to her, but he would admit she was pretty, even if she did have an aroma of dirt and sweat. "That'll have to do," she said, looking unimpressed. She gave the door 3 loud knocks and waited for it to open. Seconds later it did. A man of about 30, with a large blonde beard and unkempt, wavy shoulder-length hair, opened the door. His grey eyes were magnified behind the thickest lenses. His plump cheeks and belly suggested he liked food and beer. He wore nothing on his feet that poked out of baggy blue denim jeans. He looked half homeless, half geek. His expression was gormless, like a blank canvas. Then suddenly it changed. "Oh dear God!" he shouted, dropping his can of Coke. He tried to move quickly, but a man of his size took his time to start running. "Cal, wait! He's with us!" shouted Lacole, but it was too late. He was racing at 6 miles per hour across his living room. He tripped on a computer wire and crashed into the bottom of his desk. Picture frames and a couple of books landed on his head. He clumsily reattached his glasses and looked back towards the doorway. Without a hint of embarrassment, the blank canvas reappeared upon his face. "This is your secret weapon," said Harper, smiling, stepping into the room. 27. Heartbreak. Black rubber boots could be heard in the school corridor, and dark clouds outside had forced the caretaker to light the candles in the chandeliers. It provided a tunnel of light to their destination. 3 EE officers walked in silence. One palmed his baton, enjoying the smooth finish, wondering if today it would get to taste blood. They passed the locker room and entered the corridor of classrooms. They saw the black number 7 on the window of a tainted door, which meant they had arrived at their destination. They broke the glass of the door and looked through the jagged hole. Teenage faces stared, turning pale, except one remained a shade darker than the rest. They opened the door and entered. The old teacher struggled to get his words out. "Who on earth do you think you are?" Their eyes didn't even look at him. They just hardened on the boy in the middle. The teacher stepped in bravely towards the officer, but he was greeted by a baton. The EE guard's blood pond had been answered. It sent the old man back while blood spilled from his nose as he hit his back on the edge of his desk, crippling him to a heap on the floor. "Back, old man," said the guard, looking at the blood in the old man's white hair. Screaming kids got to their feet, knocking over desks, clawing at each other in a panic to leave the classroom. Iram got to his feet, but he was encircled by men dressed as Dread. "Where are you going, boy?" asked one of them with a smile, then slinging the desk aside. Iram stared with hate as another grabbed him by the collar. He forced Iram to the ground, forcing him to stare at their shiny boots as he looked at the reflection of his own terrified eyes. "There's been a complaint," said one of them, who held him down in the now almost empty classroom. Iram heard the thunder of feet down the corridor getting quieter. He looked up and saw his teacher slumped to one side, unsure if he was dead or alive. The true horror began to take hold. He was alone. His breath quickened and his heart raced as panic clawed at his body. Then a voice came from the doorway. "Get off him!" screamed a quivering voice. There, she looked so brave but scared, shaking as her eyes watered. "You need to go, darling. This is not for you to see," said an officer. Florence didn't move. Her bottom lip quivered and tears streamed down her face. The EE guards looked at one another, shaking their heads, and then continued with business. The one who had Iram by the neck took his thick black hair and forced him up. Iram screamed in pain, and Florence echoed. "No!" she screamed, running towards them, not knowing what she intended to do. The guard who had hit the teacher raised his arm, preventing her from getting to Iram. He pushed her back, and her feet tripped, making her hit the floor hard. "You're evil!" shouted Iram. Florence's yelp halted the panic, and he flung a leg outwards, trying to kick the guard who pushed her, but it was helpless. The one who had him by the hair was like his puppet master, in total control. He pulled Iram back, making his kick fall short. "I don't think so, boy. Right, come on. This is no place for you," he said, dragging him past the toppled tables to the door. Iram was dragged down the corridor. He struggled, trying to find his feet, but to no avail. As Iram watched his world get further and further away as he was dragged to the school's main door, he could see Florence limping down the corridor, blood under her nose, with blonde hair out of place. "Iram!" she screamed, her voice travelling with clarity down the corridor as she watched him dragged out the building. She watched the door close and her soulmate fall from sight. She tried to run down the corridor, but her injured left leg gave way. She hit the stone floor hard. But barely noticing the cuts on her knees and hands, she got to her feet. She ran to the school entrance, slamming open the doors and nearly falling down the steps outside. In front of the school was a black van with the letters EE painted on the side. Most of the school stood aside, including the teachers, watching Iram slung into the back. The guards then got in, and the back doors slammed shut as the wheels spun in the gravel, kicking up little stones towards the trees that surrounded the drive. Florence's shoes also kicked up the little stones as she got to her feet and watched the van disappear into a low fog on the main road. Her knees hit the ground. Her skirt circled her bare legs. She began to cry into her hands as emotion poured out. Condensation from her tears rose above her head. She felt the cold. It was in the pit of her stomach. Unable to understand what had happened, she heard a voice. "My God, what's happened?" said the voice of Mrs. Snowdon, her English teacher. Florence listened to her steps approach in the gravel, but she couldn't bring herself to look up. Even if she'd known the answer, she wouldn't have been able to speak. 28. Hope. A soldier, journalist, and a child sat in a computer geek's apartment. Cowell sat at his long desk that was parallel to the front door. On the desk was one laptop next to a desktop computer. Next to that was empty Coke cans and a pizza box. To the right of the desk was a room with an old brown leather sofa. Harper sat on one side, Lacole sat on the other. Bella sat quietly on a beanbag opposite the sofa. In the middle of the room was a red Persian rug. They had been talking for some time about their plan, and Harper had just about had enough. "Okay, let me get this straight. You intend to take down this totalitarian government with a fat guy," said Harper, pointing at Cowell. "A computer and a pirate radio station. You can't be serious," said Harper, looking back at Lacole like she was crazy. "Fat guy? That's clever, coming from a killer of a fat," said Cowell. He had barely finished his sentence when his cheeks turned red. He looked at Bella, remembering the short conversation with Lacole in his kitchen. Bella looked at him, sipping on her Coke through a pink straw. She smiled. Cowell looked down at his desk and felt embarrassment take over his body, feeling the dampness of his armpits and Lacole's stare. "Think next time," said Harper in a commanding tone as his opinion further lowered of Cowell. Lacole stood up and walked to Bella, sitting the child on her knees, then sitting back on the beanbag, beginning to massage her young shoulders. The atmosphere was suffocating, and the vision she had put together in the last 2 weeks had to be heard. "Open your eyes. It's not a fat guy on a computer. It's communication, a voice. We have to give the people that," said Lacole, trying to rescue the situation. Her voice was full of hope. Harper looked at her, then down at Bella, and noticed a resemblance in them. Their features and their soft skin was the same. It was as though he was looking at Lacole's inner child. It gave her an innocence Harper felt, and it was hard not to open up to. "Okay, how?" said Harper, as Lacole sipped on Bella's straw. "Hey!" shouted Bella, then laughing, as Lacole gulped down the fizzy pop. "Cowell set up a social network. It's on a secret server, and we can communicate with that. It's hope. That's what we give. That's how," said Lacole. "How are we going to get the people onto this site?" said Harper, with his arms folded. "Well, since the government have stopped independent broadcasts on TV, people have been using the radio a lot more." "There's no TV?" "No, well, not really. But that's beside the point." "Wow. Are you listening? As I was saying, the government doesn't seem too bothered about policing the radio, and there's a new station in town that people like," said Lacole proudly. "Which?" said Harper. "Ours," said Cowell, pointing at an old radio broadcaster in the corner of the room. Cowell looked smug. The radio system looked ancient. "I thought the old transmitters had been turned off. FM, AM, you know," said Harper. "Look beside the desk. It's hooked up to a computer. It's incredible what you can do with technology these days. Don't worry, it's all digital as well. It's going nowhere." "If it's actually digital, why do you need a nation hunk of junk?" "We use the microphone. We could be using something more modern, but Cowell likes the whole look and the feel of it. Adds an authenticity, he says." "And what does this music station play? Contemporary, or do you like classical?" said Harper patronisingly. "Neither. We often tell people on the website when the broadcasts are going out, and people tune in. It's as simple as that," said Cowell, not hearing Harper's sarcasm. "Why doesn't the government close down your website?" "Well, you can't really police the internet, not if you know what you're doing. And we know what we're doing. The government are always just playing catch-up. We're elusive." Harper didn't want to give Cowell another reason to look smug, so he kept quiet. Lacole stood up and walked towards the radio system, wiping off the dust of the top and tapping the metal microphone. "We've been broadcasting 2 weeks, telling people about the website, trying to offer answers and information, giving people hope, making them feel safe," said Lacole, sitting on the chair in front of the microphone. Harper didn't look impressed. His arms were folded and his eyes rolled as he turned away from Lacole and the radio system. "I just don't see—" But before Harper could finish, Lacole interrupted him. "The site averages 4,000 views a day, and it's growing fast," said Lacole. Harper tried not to look too shocked. He looked at Cowell, who took a bite of cold pizza and cheese hung down his chin. "How'd you like that?" said Cowell, washing it down with Coke. 29. Sleepover. Feeling squeaky springs in his back, Harper laid on a thin mattress in a tiny room. He thought about Leach and Walker. He wondered how his friends had been manipulated so easily. He didn't see them in the chaos on the streets, but he was sure they were there, destroying people's lives. He felt a sadness inside, feeling he could have maybe saved Walker and Leach from the madness. But they had made their choice, taken by the evil of the so-called EE, regimented murderers to be pawns in the fingertips of the new Prime Minister. Harper's thoughts then turned to the dossier, literature that allowed them to read their opponents' minds. They were playing chess against the devil, but this devil had an army. But wherever their attack may be, they could simply vanish into the city. Even this Prime Minister wasn't going to destroy his own streets. He wanted to scare people. The idea was to frighten people so badly they would leave on their own accord, and Harper then got goosebumps at the thought of him and Lacole helping the innocent. From his bed, he looked out the door. It was slightly ajar, and he could see Cowell in his chair, behind his computer snoring with a pizza box in his lap. He listened carefully and could faintly hear the pre-recorded message playing beside the microphone of the radio system. It was Lacole's voice. He listened to the message that would sound through the night, travelling on cold airwaves with a warm message. "When fear is gone, we stop listening. We know the feelings of others. I hope one day to live in a place where little is said and where people share bread. Do we need to know about the bad when it makes the happy sad? Or because of a few? Yes, we do. Because one day they may do something to you. Remember what's good, remember what's right, and that sometimes it's okay to fight. Meet me tomorrow at 11 a.m. at Trafalgar Square. My name is Lacole." The message repeated. It wasn't loud, but it was strong. As Harper lay there, he heard voices from a nearby bedroom he couldn't see. It was Bella's laughter. She giggled, and it made Harper smile and filled his heart with happiness. "Be good now," Harper heard faintly. It was Lacole. "Good night," said Bella. "Good night, darling," said Lacole. Harper thought he heard a faint kiss and listened to the footsteps leave the bedroom. He listened to the light switch turn off, then footsteps approach his room. Lacole stood in his doorway, and she leaned on the doorframe, wearing nothing but black underwear and now a clean white vest top that barely covered her stomach. She wasn't tall, but she was very slim, and her legs seemed elegant. She'd had a shower, and her brown hair was wet and shined. Her face was clean, revealing a white soft glow, making her smile seem now kinder, and her eyes brighter. "Hey," said Lacole. "Hey," said Harper. "I just want to say thank you." "For what?" "For being there, for being here. It means a lot," said Lacole with an awkward smile. "It's fine. You don't have to say thank you." "No, but thank you," said Lacole, smiling again and stepping away from the door. "Lacole," said Harper. Lacole looked back over her shoulder. "This is where I want to be," said Harper, more seriously. "There's nothing more than I want right now than to be here with you. Do you understand?" His voice was almost desperate. It felt strange for him to feel that way. "Thank you." "Lacole." "Yeah?" "Where's your name come from? I've never heard it before," said Harper. "Well, it's originally Native American, but I'm not. It means freedom of the people." "Are you serious?" "Yeah," said Lacole, laughing delicately. "I always just thought it sounded nice. I guess it's becoming more than just a name," said Lacole, giving a sweet smile. "Good night, Harry," she said, walking away. "Me too. Me too," whispered Harper to himself, shutting his eyes, trying to fall asleep after a day that had changed his life. Lacole wasn't sure about Harry Harper as she walked to her room. She thought his story was believable enough, based on how and where she found him. He listened and spoke calmly. He also appeared genuine and kind, which bothered her. How did he become a part of the murder regiment? She couldn't trust him completely. The leather boots and the black trousers still resonated evil. She felt slightly uneasy around him. She tried to look strong when looking into his eyes, holding his gaze, trying to portray a strength that barely existed. Harper could see through it, and she knew it, and it left her feeling vulnerable. She knew deep down she was transparent. She sometimes felt like crying. What she didn't know was Harper admired her for trying to look so strong. Lacole lay on her own bed. It was better than Harper's. The mattress didn't make noises. Her mind wandered towards Bella. As she thought of the child, the destruction, the chaos, and the horror of the situation, it all became real. She saw misery in Bella's beautiful eyes. It was there Lacole had found her purpose. When she had seen Harper holding her in the concrete room, a happiness glimmered in the evil. She could never leave her. Just thinking of the child made her want to cry. She wouldn't admit it, but she knew in Bella's misery she could find happiness. Population. The next day the autumn air was brisk and cool, and Harper, Lacole and Bella stood on the steps of Trafalgar Square. The air seemed cleaner than usual. Perhaps it was just the city that could be seen better without the traffic and no people. Because London was virtually empty, a skeleton city where structure existed but purpose didn't. Faces had seemed to evaporate, and the heart of the country had stopped. But there was something unexpected, a pleasantness, a beauty that had bloomed. Never before seen details were alive and much more fantastic now. The grass in the gardens were greener, the birdsong was louder. It was now the city's music that soothed the senses. Harper was amazed, and it was made all the sweeter by the feel of a little girl's hand in his. Harper also noticed something else. It was Lacole. She was beautiful. In the sunlight, she somehow looked different. Her hair and skin glowed and seemed so perfectly humane. He hadn't noticed before, but her teeth were actually perfect and pure white. She illuminated a natural beauty Harper had not seen before. Something he'd been searching for, but not known it. Lacole held Bella's other hand, and together they swung the little girl in the autumn air as they laughed in rare serenity. Harper thought Lacole's laughter was magical. It was the first time he'd seen her smile properly. It made him feel good, something he hadn't felt for a long time. Lacole walked to the highest step and looked out, rising on her tiptoes. "Loving the enthusiasm," said Harper sarcastically, but with a smile. Harper stood on the step below with a rifle in his hand as Bella played close by. "I'm trying," said Lacole, gazing into the distance. "I think if anyone were coming, they'd be here by now." They will, just wait," Sure, said Harper, rolling his eyes. You lack hope, said Lacole, looking at Nelson's statue. Probably. I lost it yesterday. So much broken glass, so much broken dreams, said Harper, feeling empty. Pull yourself together. We need strength. We need hope, said Lacole as Harper rolled his eyes again. The two looked at each other for a moment when Bella peered out and pointed. Look! A crowd of men was gathering, about 200 metres away. They walked towards where they were stood, seeming to shuffle. Their walks were disjointed and scattered as they approached. They could see so many faces that were covered with scarves and hoods, as black beady eyes watched with suspicion. There was a chaos in their approach. It suggested an aggression, but contained a weak intrigue. Their clothes were a mix of jeans, trainers and tracksuits. They didn't talk, which made their approach eerie. At the steps below them, the crowd halted. Roughly 100 pair of eyes glared at Harper and Lacole. The stare said, "Get on with it." Thank you. Thank you for coming," said Lacole nervously. Her voice shook and sounded thin on the air. Closer, she could see the faces were young, but they dripped with rage. As Lacole tried to speak, it was as though the air had disappeared, and her words had nothing to travel onto. Half a minute almost passed. It felt like an eternity of emptiness. "What the hell do you want?" came a voice from the crowd. Harper turned to Lacole, trying to rid her of stage fright. "Lacole, the dossier. Tell them about the dossier," he said with a hiss, trying to whisper. I can help," said Lacole suddenly. A murmuring amongst the crowd broke out. "What's a woman gonna do?" shouted a deep voice, bringing everything to a silence. A man stepped forward. He was a giant. You could see African heritage, but his skin was light, something almost beige and yellow, giving him a look of toxicity. Veins in his neck were like pipes pumping blood to his brain. His jaw protruded and looked strong enough to bite through steel. He wore a fingerine vest and grey jeans. His name was Chirac, and he took a deep breath from his enormous chest and spoke again. "You aren't from round here, I can tell. You don't know what it's like. Look at you. Take away that gun, and you're just a 21st century macaroni weaned from Daddy's credit card. You think you can be our personal Jesus to us pagans? We will shout hallelujah. You're a different breed. And I'm not sure if you're stupid or brave, but it's a fine line you're walking, woman," said Chirac, glaring. He'd made his way to the front of the crowd. Harper looked down from the steps, and he couldn't believe the size of the man. He was reminded of Bestower. Harper wanted to take control, worried about the man's potential if he got angry. "Shut up and listen to her," said Harper. His words came out more confident than he felt. "And look at you. You even look like one of them. Spent some days in the ghetto and think you know it. You don't know shit," said Chirac, snarling. With a grunt, he turned his back on Harper and Lacole, walking back through the crowd that parted for him. Lacole felt he possessed an authority, a meaningful place in this group of men. She felt if she could reach his soul and trigger belief, it would resonate with the others. "So, because of who I am and where I'm from, you don't want to listen to me?" said Lacole enticingly. "You got it," said Chirac, not even turning to look at her. "Well, that makes you no better than the people that are doing this to you," said Lacole. There was a sting in her words, and she had cut something open. Chirac stopped. With his feet planted in the ground, he turned slowly and looked back at Lacole. "How dare you?" said Chirac, turning, then taking steps towards them. He stared at Harper, trying to work him out. Harper tried to look confident, but Chirac possessed a powerful aura. He took several more steps and saw Harper's eyes flicker away. Harper's heart began to beat faster. The size of the man overwhelmed him, physically and mentally. Harper forfeited. He raised his rifle to Chirac's head, and the giant stopped and smiled. "You're scared," said Chirac, taking his eyes off Harper, then putting them on Lacole and winking. Like before, Chirac turned his back and walked away. Lacole felt desperation as she saw her vision walking away. "We can help! I have the plans of the EE. We can stop them!" shouted Lacole. But the crowd had begun to walk away, following Chirac in the same scattered way they had arrived. "Save yourself, lady, and get out of here while you can," said Chirac, walking past the fountains. "You aren't safe!" shouted Lacole, as they dispersed into the nearby streets. "I'm sorry, Lacole," said Harper. "Don't be. We will change this," said Lacole frantically. She ran down a few steps and began to shout louder. "Lacole, please stop," said Harper. "No! They live not far from here, and there are attacks here planned tonight. I'll offer them an answer. I'll give them hope. I will save them," said Lacole, watching the last man disappear from sight. 31. Eager. In Cowell's flat, they sat silently in the night. Flimsy yellow curtains looked more like rags drawn shut, and a dirty lamp light occasionally flickered. Harper had been pacing across the room on the Persian rug that crumpled up. He bit the corners of his nails, biting the skin around them, as the sound of gunshots echoed in the night, with the occasional scream. "Is there nothing we can do? I can't stand it," said Harper, unable to contain his frustration. He looked around and felt disgusted at Cowell, who stared at his computer desk, and Lacole, who sat silently on the sofa. Gunshots became more frequent, growing like the tension. "They should have listened." "Are you not going to say anything?" said Harper, looking at Lacole with a face of anxiety. "What do you want me to say?" "They said they didn't care," said Lacole emotionlessly, staring at the wooden floor. "We should get out there. Take the fight to them. We have 2 rifles. Come on, let's go make the difference," said Harper, trying to gain Lacole's eye contact. Her body stayed still and her eyes raised and met his. "I'm trying to make the difference," she said with a stare. "But ideas like that don't help anyone. We can't fight them, not physically. Like you said, we have 2 rifles. They have 200. So please sit down, and you're giving me a headache," said Lacole, slamming her hands on the sofa and standing up, walking past Harper, brushing shoulders. She walked into the kitchen and filled the kettle with water. "I ain't fighting no one," said Cowell, opening a packet of crisps. He began to pour the packet into his gullet, and crumbs fell into his beard, illuminated a greenish yellow in the light of his computer screen. "That's not surprising. I'll let you know when the EE are serving side orders of chips with the abuse," said Harper with despise. "Lay off him. He's done 10 times what you have done. Not everything is sold with a gun," said Lacole, pouring boiling water into a mug with instant coffee inside it. Harper had almost forgotten what they used to call him in the army, the Angel of Death. The destruction of the EE had awakened him to evil he was once a part of. He could see more clearly now his past, and it haunted him. He despised it. He had felt an emotional change inside him. Like an emotional defibrillator had made his heart beat again. The numbness had begun to ease, and ideas of right and wrong had prevalence again. Perhaps it was seeing the terror that death injected into people's lives. Or maybe it was Lacole. Did she have a hold on him? She brought out emotions he hadn't felt since he was a teenager. He wasn't going to lie to himself anymore, it was true. She did fascinate him. Whether it was seeing the true evil of war, or being around a beautiful woman, it didn't matter. He felt alive again. Feelings he didn't understand yet resulted in aggression and frustration. He clenched his fists and walked towards the room where he was calling his bedroom. Harper slammed his door hard, then slung himself on the bed. The door rattled off the frame and swung back open, revealing Harper to the others in the living room. They peered in, looking at the sulking man who resembled a spoilt child. Bella jumped off the sofa and walked to Harper's door. "You want me to close the door, Harry?" asked Bella nicely. Lacole couldn't contain herself. She laughed loudly, covering her mouth, trying not to spill her coffee. "No, it's fine," said Harper, getting off the bed. He walked to the door and looked at Lacole, trying not to laugh, and Cowell's gormless stare. He then ran his hand through Bella's hair and said good night. He shut the door and lay back on the thin mattress, gazing at the ceiling. His mind focused on little, but the embarrassment lingered like a bad itch. A little later there was a couple of knocks on the door. It was Lacole, and she walked in, smiling as she shut the door behind her. "Hey, soldier," said Lacole warmly. "Yeah," said Harper, barely looking at her. "Still coming to Trafalgar Square tomorrow, to give the people a second chance. I sent out the message again." "Of course. And I'm going to try and get some sleep now. You should do the same," said Harper. "Okay," said Lacole, smiling. She exited Harper's room, and she shut the door quietly. She looked at Cowell behind his desk and rolled her eyes, then grinned. "What an ass," said Cowell, finishing another packet of crisps. 32. Plead. The trio stood on the steps of Trafalgar Square as they did the day before. They waited in silence, and from the moment they left their apartment building that morning the fog had been getting worse, and it was now impossible to see further than 10 metres. They waited in a dead hope that was saddening. Then, through the cool fog, slowly appeared a silhouette forcing its way through the grey mist. Features appeared in the dim light, with broad hunching shoulders and biceps swinging from a huge body. It was Chirac. He frowned with what looked like rage, and looked up slowly, looking like he was about to break. Maybe himself, maybe Lacole and Harper. Harper had seen the look before. It was the last look in a man before he gave up on life. Harper's grip tightened on the rifle. The Colossus' hands rose to his face, and he let out an awful noise. He fell to his knees and began to cry, uncontrollably, struggling to take in the air to fill his massive lungs. Confused, Lacole and Harper watched, not daring to approach the troubled giant. Other men appeared through the fog, with their faces distraught with sorrow as well. The crowd slowly gathered and watched the giant, who cried like a child. Bella stood next to Harper and Lacole. She looked up with her big blue eyes, then walked down the steps towards the crying man. Harper and Lacole noticed too late. She was stood in front of him, and she opened her arms, her tiny limbs barely reaching around the arm that held onto his face. Chirac's whimpers stopped, and everything fell silent. "Don't cry," said Bella softly. Chirac smiled, like he was looking at heaven. He began to smile then laugh, wiping away his tears. Lacole and Harper approached slowly down the steps. The barrier had been broken. Harper held out his hand, and Chirac looked up with a conflict in his mind. Then with a grimace, he took Harper's hand. Harper pulled, feeling the huge weight of the man as Chirac stood. He towered over Harper, but his face now seemed softer. Maybe it was the tears glistening on his face. "So many are dead," said Chirac, penetrating Harper's core. They did not know what to say. There was just sympathy that someone else had suffered at the hands of the EE. The crowd gathered in closer, looking at Lacole for some answer. "You know how to beat these people," said Chirac. His eyes seemed big like a child's, pleading for help. "Yes," said Lacole, nodding defiantly. "Thank you," whispered Chirac. Lacole walked up the steps behind her and looked at the small crowd of men in grey fog. She took a deep breath and felt emotion take her to a higher place. "Something has happened," said Lacole, seriously looking out. "Something destructive and vile. Now we stand alone in the streets, looking for hope. Your country has not turned your back on you, because we are the country. We are the people. We make the difference. We shall not allow this to happen. Today, we say no." She watched the men step closer, all looking up with glowing eyes and nodding heads. "Today, we take back the streets." Lacole paused, watching them, desperate for her to speak again. "Today, we take back our country," shouted Lacole, punching the air. The crowd roared with a cheer. Hope filled their hearts and the air around them. The men lingered in the cold morning for some time, talking to each other, but really waiting to speak to Lacole. They told her their stories, and she told them about the dossier, how she could keep them safe. She told them about the network and the radio station, and how they could be one step ahead. She told them about the hard work of Cowell, but mostly she told them to spread the word. The morning came to an end. An idea had been implanted deep inside roughly 100 men's minds. She noticed a fire burning inside them, a fire nobody could now contain. She knew they would take the message and light the souls of others. Lacole's vision was a light. Everything changed. Over the next weeks, the number of people on the social network doubled daily. Safe and unsafe zones were constantly broadcasted from Cowell's flat. Lacole gave a radio broadcast every night, telling of their progress, giving them hope. The name Lacole began to shoot through the inner city like an electrical charge. It provided an energy to people who hadn't felt it for a year. People began to walk the streets again, and they spoke to one another, and occasionally moments of child's laughter could be heard. The streets weren't busy, but they hummed. Another week passed, and Harper walked down the street and saw a child with her mother who skipped by. Harper watched the small boy who pretended to have a gun. "Look, Mum, I'm fighting the yee." Harper smiled slightly, but he was a little shocked, wondering if the kid had got the right message. But he was encouraged by the boy's passion. But then he noticed something on the wall behind the boy that surprised him even more. A poster. It was of Lacole. In it, she pointed at an orange sky while making a speech. Her face was tense and she looked like she was shouting at a crowd. She didn't look angry. She was inspiring. Harper read aloud the word at the bottom in bold white writing. Saviour. Harper was astonished. Her vision had become a reality. So quickly. As he walked the streets, he saw it several times, all the way back to Cowell's flat. He walked into Cowell's flat, and the place was empty. He walked into his little room, climbed on his thin mattress, and pulled out a diary from under his bed. Taking a pencil from inside it, he began to write. Lacole's vision has become a reality faster than I could ever imagine. Daily messages and updates are keeping people safe, far away from the EE, away from destruction and harm. Armed with this 48-page dossier, she is saving lives. She is creating hope. She's creating something big, an idea. I now realise in life there are things worth fighting for. I think to some degree that something is Lacole. She's become the embodiment of our freedom. She isn't just the messenger. She is the reason. "33. Understanding. Harper awoke the next morning to the smell of fried bacon and smiled. It made him get out of bed quicker than normal. He didn't yearn for that extra 5-minute snooze. He stood and stretched, reaching his arms up and twisting his back, hoping he'd been taken into consideration as he imagined Lacole dishing up thick rashers of bacon onto his plate with a fresh cup of coffee. He stepped out of his room and was bitterly disappointed. He saw Cowell with what looked like half a pig in a frying pan. The other half was Cowell, thought Harper. Harper was wearing only his white boxer shorts as he stepped into the living room. As he spent most of his time around like-minded men in the army, he thought little of it. He was in incredible shape, like he could be on the cover of a health magazine. He was naturally and incredibly athletic, but he didn't really have to work at it, just some press-ups here and there and good genes. Cal rolled his eyes, trying not to show how uncomfortable he felt around Harper's near-naked presence. Lacole sat at the breakfast table and gazed longingly at Harper's body. Then she realised what she was doing and attempted to speak quickly. "Oh, you sleep well?" said Lacole, still staring, then forcing herself to look down at her plate. But her eyes defied her and flickered back towards Harper. "Fine, thanks. I'm starving, though," said Harper, pulling a chair up to the table. Bella drank orange juice opposite him and sat looking sweet as she always did. Harper looked at Cowell in the kitchen, wondering if he'd taken notice of his hungry comment. It didn't seem so. The fat man was transfixed on his food and the aroma of sizzling bacon. Harper frowned at the sight of Cowell, who looked like he was going to climax at the smell of pork. Cowell quickly dished the bacon onto a plate and joined the rest at the table, waddling over and licking his lips. He reached for the ketchup and poured half the bottle onto his plate, then began to eat there like there was no tomorrow. "Well, I've just used the last load of bacon," said Cowell. He looked up at Harper as juicy strips of bacon fell out of his mouth and grease dripped down his chin. He ate like a feral cat, low to his plate, ramming food into his mouth. Harper didn't contain his smile. He just looked with pity as he poured himself some orange juice. Lacole pulled up the laptop to the table. She was concentrating on the screen as Harper decided to make a coffee, feeling the craving for caffeine. "What's the plan today then, Lacole?" said Harper as he picked up his mug from the sink. "More speeches, 2 today. It's amazing. The crowds are getting bigger. More people are hearing our message." "It is amazing," said Harper, listening to the kettle boil. "Yup," said Lacole, smiling and clicking. "Are you okay to look after Bella today? I would take her myself, but there's a lot of walking and I don't think she'll enjoy it." "Yeah, of course," said Harper, pouring boiling water onto a mountain of coffee granules. "We're going to have some fun today, Bella, eh?" said Harper, walking back to the table and helping himself to some cold toast off Bella's plate. "Yeah," said Bella. "Can we go to the park, Harry?" said Bella, giving Harper the sweetest smile. Harper looked at Lacole, who knew the dossier inside out. She gave him the nod, meaning it was safe. "Yeah, sure we can, Bella, sure we can," said Harper with an exaggerated smile. Harper and Bella walked through the city towards the green grass of the park. It had a multicoloured climbing frame and a sandpit, and a bench that faced the park enclosed by trees, making it a perfect square. Grass surrounded the trees, and autumn was visible in the scattering of brown leaves that littered the grass in the park. The park wasn't great, but it was a welcome place of tranquillity. Bella ran to the sandpit, giggling as she did. The sand was slightly damp, reflecting the overcast sky above them. In the sandpit was a little boy who played alone. Then Harper noticed a lone woman on the nearby bench. Bella dived into the sand, and the boy said hello, and in moments they were digging together. There was hardly an introduction, just mutual love for fun. Harper smiled at the woman on the bench and walked over. The woman was skinny and looked young. She'd wrapped herself in a brown blanket. Her hair seemed unnaturally dark, maybe dyed, making her eyes look vibrant. Her wrists looked painfully thin, like they could break in a strong wind. Harper noticed her smile as he got closer, but it was tired. It was friendly but worn, a smile from eyes that had seen too much. "Hey," said Harper warmly, taking a seat beside her. "Hello," said the woman, running her finger through her dry hair, tucking it behind her ears. "Your daughter is beautiful," said the young mother. Before he corrected her, he thought about her parents, a story he didn't want to tell. "Thank you," said Harper, feeling awful. "They seem to be getting on well," said Harper, looking at the children who was building a sandcastle. "Just fine," said the mother, as her smile disappeared, and her face looked gloomy, matching the sky. Her age perplexed Harper. She had bright, youthful eyes, but a vulnerable frame, and tired expression that made him unsure. Was she 25 or 45? "Is everything okay?" said Harper. The woman gave him a weak smile. It looked tiring for her. "I guess I just find it hard to pretend nothing's wrong." Harper knew what she meant. The world was different now. If a picture could sum it up, a crying mother alone on a bench might just do it. "It'll get better," said Harper, sliding in closer to her. "I hope so. I really do," said the woman. She didn't cry. She looked too depressed to cry. "I should be hopeful. I know there are people out there trying to do their best, like that young woman I hear so much about. She's amazing." "Lacole?" "Yes, I really appreciate what she's doing. I really do," said the woman, turning to Harper, looking at him with unusually large bright eyes. It began to rain, and they both looked skyward. "But sometimes I wonder if it's enough. I want to see him grow into a better world," she said, looking at her child. "Not this one," she said, covering herself in her blanket. Bella and the little boy ran up to the bench, with clumps of wet sand falling from their little feet. "Harry, it's raining," said Bella, tugging on Harper's hand and laughing. Harper looked at the woman beside him and noticed the look she gave him, wondering why she hadn't called him Daddy. "Are you going that way?" said Harper, pointing as the rain began to fall heavier. The woman smiled and stood up. Her hair looked black now, and it clumped together, revealing patches of her scalp. She didn't protect herself from the rain. She simply walked up to Harper and took his arm, and they walked out the park. Harper looked down at her, as she was wet, pale and tired, but she was pretty. Her delicate features had a vulnerability, but her brave smile, that kept her attractive. As they walked past the trees, the two adults faced one another and smiled. She moved in close to Harper and hugged him, closing her eyes tightly in his chest. She took that brief moment to forget everything and feel a second of safety. Then she let go. Harper watched her walk away, through the rain, with her young boy into the city. Harper stood with Bella, feeling sorry for the mother he knew was going home alone. Even though she hadn't asked, he knew she wanted him to follow. There had been that last look, an inviting silence, with a slight smile that said, "Please." He wondered if the boy's daddy had been killed by the EE. He felt for the woman, deeply, and wondered how many like her were in the city, lost in loneliness. Bella took his hand and led Harper back in the direction of what they called home. She looked up at Harper with a cheeky smile, one that truly astonished him. 34. Torch. Several days of peace had passed, and Harper sat alone in Cowell's flat, which was now sometimes referred to as headquarters. Harper was on his back. His toes were tightly tucked under the sofa. His hands were on his head, and he worked up a sweat doing sit-ups. The press-ups had been done already. He was coming to the end of his routine, feeling the burn on his abs. No pain, no gain, he thought. Then Lacole appeared at the door, out of breath. "There's a problem," said Lacole, throwing the dossier in Cowell's desk. She flicked the pages open as Harper grabbed a towel, wiping sweat from his forehead. "There are raids planned here tonight," said Lacole, slamming her finger onto the page, waiting for Harper to respond, who filled up a glass of water in the kitchen. "Have you broadcast it? Told people to avoid them areas?" he said, drinking, walking back to the desk. "No, you don't understand. Here, this street," she said, with worried eyes. Harper inspected the document. "Not good," said Harper, sounding more serious. "What if they decide to break down the door? Raid the building? What if they find the computers and destroy the radio? Then what?" "It would be the end of everything," said Lacole. Harper thought deeply, coming to a conclusion almost immediately. "We can't let them." "What do you mean?" said Lacole. "We have to confront them," said Harper, turning, nodding with an excited look, as he walked to the centre of the room. "Me, Chirac, and his friends will go out. We will stand strong. They won't expect it," said Harper. "They won't like that," said Lacole, not looking enthusiastic at all, not keen on confrontation. "It will buy us time, and they will stick to their dossier after it. They're regimented. Rigidness, it's the military's problem." "Won't it make things worse?" "Worse than what?" said Harper. Lacole knew his meaning, but still questioned him. "What if it doesn't work?" "Unfortunately, I used to be one of them. I know the effect of a counter-strike." Lacole breathed in deeply, accepting his proposal. "Okay, well, the attack begins at 10:30 p.m, so we need to hurry, and we should make sure we're at," said Lacole, pointing at the document, as Harper interrupted. "What do you mean, we?" "You're not coming," said Harper. "What?" said Lacole, giving him a glare. Harper realised she might be misconstruing it as sexism. "Look, Lacole, you are too valuable now. What if things turn violent? Who would the people listen to then? Who would they believe in?" said Harper, putting his hand on her shoulders. "Don't you dare. I brought you into this," said Lacole, pushing his hands away. "I don't want you to get hurt, that's all," said Harper, revealing a glimpse of his emotions towards her. "I don't care," said Lacole. Harper felt his words like a dagger. "And Bella? How would she feel if something happened to you?" said Harper, using her dagger and turning it against her, drawing emotions from her veins. Lacole paused and looked vacant for several seconds. "Okay, I'll stay, but if I hear anything, I'm coming out to help," said Lacole. Harper nodded and smiled, then ran to get his coat beside the door. He looked back to Lacole, embracing her presence, then headed out the door to find Chirac. The day became night. Underneath an old rail bridge, lights shone in the night. It was fire, lit torches of slow-burning wood held by Chirac's men and Harper, who waited for the EE. For every fire, there was 2 men, a torch-bearer and a rifle-holder. The men waited to listen to the crackle of the fire, keeping them warm. They were ready, a long line of men looking intense, formidable, almost disturbing in the dark. Their faces in the firelight seemed to hover in the night, giving them a ghostly presence. "Sure they're coming," said Chirac to Harper, staring blindly into the night. "We haven't been wrong yet," said Harper, holding a torch that danced in the dark. Suddenly in front of them, pale faces appeared from their shadows. Their uniforms blended into the dark. It was Bestower. He led from the front, with his head a foot higher than the rest of the men next to him. A line of EE guards came to a halt, 10 feet from Harper and his men. The only thing separating them were guns and fire that flickered between tension. Harper could only make out Bestower for sure. He looked like a silverback gorilla next to chimps. It was the first time he had seen him since he escaped, and nobody moved, but the message was clear. The EE's silence spoke a novel to Harper. "Leave," said Harper, interrupting the silence over the crackling of fire. Harper noticed a guard's face peer towards the amber light. It was Leach.
"Harper, that you?"
said Leach, not believing what he was seeing.
"Shut up,"
said Bestower to his comrade, his voice like thunder, almost demon-like.
"We should have known you had something to do with this,"
said Bestower, simmering with rage. The silent air was abundant with fear and rage. It was suffocating.
"Leave,"
said Harper again. His calm tone felt alien in such a hostile place. The EE was silent. They didn't want to show it, but they were intimidated. They waited for Bestower to make his decision. But even he didn't want to be shot under a damp rail bridge in the middle of the night.
"Have it your way,"
grunted Bestower, knowing they wouldn't hesitate to pull their triggers if he made the wrong move. He held his face furthest away from surrender as he could manage, and looked evil and possessed. His pale face turned into the shadows, and slowly the rest followed him into the night, looking like spirits walking into the underworld.
"I don't believe it,"
said Chirac. Harper said nothing. He only smiled, watching them fade away. "35. Nations. In a circular hall, diplomats of the last nations of Europe sat at their desks discussing issues that plagued their countries. They looked aged by the events that had befallen the world in the last decade, tired of relentless but necessary change that kept their world alive. It was a universal belief the only way they could prosper was by working together. They believed in unity, the cohesion of nations, ruled under a common government. They dressed in identical suits with royal blue ties, a sign of their unity, their uniform. Difference was offensive, but one man wanted to be different. He had a vision of his own. The Prime Minister of Britain sat low in his chair, wearing a red tie. Behind him stood 2 EE guards, over each shoulder, never faltering. The Prime Minister gazed at the ceiling, looking around carelessly as the other leaders discussed matters. He hadn't said anything. The others were not sure if it was ignorance or arrogance. Either way, they despised him. They looked and sneered, finding his hostility confusing. What was it he was trying to achieve? Some looked down at him, thinking he was a self-loathing man portraying a power he did not possess. Others felt a genuine fear. Seeing him as volatile and unpredictable, the universal feeling was bewilderment. The conversation continued, and they tried to put the Prime Minister to the corner of their minds. "What does the Chancellor intend to do about the current crisis?" said one. "Well, I want to make it clear our nation's taxpayers have suffered enough due to poor economic decisions abroad," said the female Chancellor in English. "So what is it you intend to do?" said an obese politician from the other side of the hall. "Well," continued the Chancellor, "I would like to highlight the lack of movement regarding this crisis. Something should have been done a long time ago. And second, I want to see a higher regulation and better monitoring within the Union, so we don't see a repeat." Lonely claps greeted the end of her sentence, claps that mirrored the sarcasm the man felt. Everyone knew where they came from. The British Prime Minister. Every diplomat in the room looked his way as he put his brown shoes on the desk in front of him. "Well, Chancellor, the long way round of saying you're doing nothing. Don't get me wrong, it sounded good. Plenty of syllables danced around our brains and masqueraded as action. But yes, a complete waste of time," said the Prime Minister, raising his eyebrows. Murmurs broke out as the other diplomats expressed their disgust. The Chancellor didn't take it badly. She'd been expecting something, and she tried the best to remain calm. A man, like a nation, shouldn't act stronger than one is," she said, smiling, as a chuckle of laughs rippled through the hall. "Obviously, there's been a misunderstanding, perhaps an error of judgment," said the Prime Minister, taking his feet off the table and adjusting his tie. "See, I measure a nation's strength the old-fashioned way, by how quickly tanks can be upon your border and my planes in your skies," said the Prime Minister. Gasps grew louder, and the Chancellor shouted to be heard. "Outrageous!" she said. The Prime Minister stood up and pulled off the microphone, clipped to his suit, and threw it on the floor. "What are you doing?" said the Chancellor, sounding scared, fearing what he might just do. "This is my country's resignation from your union, And Chancellor, you speak to me like that again, and I will have you shot in your sleep, said the Prime Minister, stepping from his desk, heading for the exit. He walked past the judging eyes of the other diplomats. He could almost smell their fear and despised them for it. He hated how they mistook privilege for greatness. He couldn't stand them. They did not challenge him, the black uniforms following the Prime Minister, that he had thoughts of confrontation. He left the door swinging and heard the eruption of an argument break out behind him. He lifted his hand, signalling the EE guard to place his mobile in his palm. He looked at his phone and pressed the green button. Next to it was Corporal Jones's name. He listened to it, and then he heard him answer. "What did you want?" said the Prime Minister, before Jones could even say hello.
"We have a problem."
"What do you mean?"
"It isn't working."
"What do you mean it isn't working?" said the Prime Minister, gripping the phone, trying hard to keep his voice down.
"Well, wherever we go, there's just nobody there. They go down the streets, raid the buildings, and, well, they're empty. It's like they know we're coming, and we can't put fear into someone who isn't there," said the corporal, waiting to be shouted at.
"Well, find them. They're rats, Jones. It isn't hard to find rats in a city," shouted the Prime Minister, spitting.
"No, sir. One other thing."
"What?"
"Well, it might be better to tell you in person," said Corporal Jones, fearing another outburst.
The Prime Minister didn't say bye. He just hung up the phone and tucked it back into his pocket. He headed down the corridor to the foyer. They walked across the marble floor towards the rotating doorway. Waiting outside the glass building was a car with blacked-out windows. The Prime Minister got in, and the car drove off. He looked up at the colourful flags of the last nations blowing in the wind, wondering how few would be flying when his vision became true.